تعجل بالقرآن من قبل أن يقضى إليك وحيه وقل رب زدني علما.
إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا وسيئات أعمالنا. من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له، وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. أما بعد. So you remember last week we were discussing the Quran being the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we mentioned the events that occurred at the time of Imam Ahmad rahimahullah ta'ala, and how there was pressure from the rulers at the time upon the scholars to say that the Quran is created, and they put that same pressure on Imam Ahmad rahimahullah ta'ala, but he refused. So that we mentioned last time. Today then we'll get into the evidences mentioned by Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah ta'ala. Al-ayatul ula, the first ayah that is mentioned here. وَإِنْ أَحَدٌ مِّنَ الْمُشْرِكِينَ اسْتَجَارَكَ فَأَجِرْهُ حَتَّى يَسْمَعَ كَلَامَ اللَّهِ. That if one of the mushrikeen seeks refuge with you, then give him that until he hears, so that he hears the speech of Allah. The ayah clearly mentions the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because in the ayah, when it mentions that if one of them seeks protection from you, seeks some type of refuge with you, then give him that until or so that he then hears the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the meaning of that, until he hears the speech of Allah, it is the Quran, by agreement of the scholars, that is in reference to the Quran, until he hears the Quran. فأجره حتى يسمع كلام الله لأن سماع كلام الله عز وجل مؤثر ولا بد. Because hearing the Quran, listening to the Quran, the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, no doubt it affects a person. It has an impact upon the one listening to the speech of Allah, to the recitation of the Quran. As Allah mentioned, إِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ لَذِكْرَى لِمَنْ كَانَ لَهُ قَلْبٌ أَوْ أَلْقَى السَّمْعَ وَهُوَ شَهِيدٌ. That indeed within that is a reminder. There is a reminder within the Quran for the one who listens with an attentive heart. The one who listens with focus and attention, with an attentive heart, then no doubt there is a great reminder in the speech of Allah for the listener. وَكَمْ مِنْ إِنسَانٍ سَمِعَ كَلَامَ اللَّهِ فَآمَنَ. And how many people there are who became Muslim as a consequence of hearing the Quran, as a consequence of listening to the Quran, they became Muslim from that. How many people? لكن بشرط أن يكون يفهمه تماما. But with the condition that they understand what was being said. So how many people, when they listen to the Quran and they understand it and they recognize the greatness of this speech, they believe and they become Muslim and enter into Islam. So here in the ayah it mentions حتى يسمع كلام الله. كلام الله أضاف الكلام إلى نفسه فقال كلام الله فدل هذا على أن القرآن كلام الله. In the ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala joins or attaches the speech to himself. Kalam Allah, Allah's speech, indicating therefore that the Quran is the speech of Allah, because Allah attributed that to himself in the ayah. Mudaf mudaf ilayhi, kalam Allah. وعقيدة أهل السنة والجماعة في القرآن يقولون. And in summary now you can write this as a definition of the Aqidah of Ahlul Sunnati wal Jama'ah when it comes to the Quran. What is our Aqidah regarding the Quran? It's like when in the Hadith the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Ad-Deenun Nasiha." This religion is nasiha, purity, sincerity. One of the points mentioned in that hadith is Lillahi wa li rasulihi wa li kitabihi. Nasiha to the book of Allah. And there are different ways of having nasiha to the book of Allah. And from the top of them all is by having the correct aqidah. By having the correct aqidah regarding the book of Allah, then that is from the nasiha to the book of Allah. So what is that correct aqidah? Ahlul Sunnah say, Inna al-Qur'ana kalamullah, munazzalun, ghayru makhluq, minhu bada'a wa ilayhi ya'ud. That the Quran is the speech of Allah. Inna al-Qur'ana kalamullah, munazzalun, it descended from Allah. Ghayru makhluq, it is not created. Minhu bada'a, from him it emanated, from him it came. Wa ilayhi ya'ud, and to him it will return. That is, in brief, the Aqidah of Ahlul Sunnah regarding the Quran, and we can explain all of that definition. All of that definition can be explained. The first part of the definition said that the Quran is Kalamullah. It is the speech of Allah. And the evidence for that we've just mentioned. That Allah said, حَتَّى يَسْمَعَ كَلَامَ اللَّهِ, until he hears the speech of Allah. And by consensus, this ayah is talking about the Quran. The ayah is not talking about that Allah will then directly speak to those mushrikun. The ayah is talking about them hearing the speech of Allah, i.e., hearing the Quran. So Allah refers to the Quran as being His speech. So that is the first part of the definition, easy and clear. It is the Kalamullah. Munazzalun. The next part in the definition we said, Munazzalun. That the Quran is revealed, descended from Allah. And the evidence for that, and there are many in the Quran, Inna anzalnahu fi laylatil qadr. Inna anzalnahu. That indeed we revealed it, we sent it. That is clear in the Quran, Surah Al-Qadr, ayah number 1. Similarly, شهر رمضان الذي أنزل فيه القرآن. شهر رمضان الذي أنزل فيه القرآن. The month of Ramadan in which the Quran was revealed. It was revealed, it was sent in the month of Ramadan. So those are clear ayat highlighting why we say Innal Qur'ana Kalamullahi Munazzalun. Then we said after that Kalamullahi Munazzalun, and then Ghayru Makhluq. Ghayru Makhluq is the next thing mentioned there, that it is not created. And the evidences for that, and again there are many, from amongst them when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, Ala lahul khalqu wal amr, that indeed to him is the creation and the command. فَجَعَلَ الْخَلْقَ شَيْئًا وَالْأَمْرَ شَيْئًا آخر لأن العطف يقتضي المغايرة والقرآن من الأمر بدليل قوله تعالى وكذلك أوحينا إليك روحا من أمرنا وما كنت تدري ما الكتاب ولا الإيمان ولكن جعلناه نورا نهدي به من نشاء من عبادنا. فإذا كان القرآن أمرا وهو قسيم للخلق صار غير مخلوق لأنه لو كان مخلوقا ما صح التقسيم. Here understand the evidence carefully. In the ayah in Al-A'raf 54, Allah says, Ala lahul khalqu wal amru. That to Allah is al-khalq and al-amr. And those two are separate things, because the waw in the Arabic indicates al-mughayarah, al-khalq wa al-amr. So the khalq, the creation, is something different to this amr which is being mentioned. The creation is something different to this amr, because in Arabic the waw for adding things together, waw al-atf, it indicates al-mughayarah. So in the ayah, the creation is one thing and this amr is something else. Then if you look at another ayah in the Quran, it tells you that the Quran is from this amr. The Quran is from this amr. Because in another ayah in Shura 52, it mentions وَكَذَلِكَ أَوْحَيْنَا إِلَيْكَ رُوحًا مِّنْ أَمْرِنَا, that we reveal to you from our amrina. When you combine the two ayat together, one ayah telling you regarding the Quran being from the amr, the other ayah telling you that there are two things, one is the creation and then one is something else, the amr, indicating the amr is different to the creation. So the creation is obviously that which has been created, and the amr, if it's different to that, must be something that was not created. If the amr is something different to the khalq is that which was created. The amr is therefore different to it. It was therefore not created. And this other ayah tells us that the Quran is from the amr. The Quran is from the amr. So by combining those evidences, we therefore realize that when Allah is talking about this amr, here it is something that is not created, it's different to the creation. And the other ayah is telling us the Quran is part of that amr. Therefore, the Quran is not created. By combining the evidences in that way. أما الدليل العقلي, but you can also have a logical explanation as to why the Quran is not created. نقول القرآن كلام الله والكلام ليس عينا قائمة بنفسها حتى يكون بائنا من الله ولو كان عينا قائمة بنفسها بائنة من الله لقلنا إنه مخلوق لكن الكلام صفة للمتكلم به فإذا كان صفة للمتكلم به وكان من الله كان غير مخلوق لأن صفات الله عز وجل كلها غير مخلوقة. Again, you have to focus. He says, logically you can understand the Quran is not created as well. And that's because the speech, is it an entity by itself? Speech, is it an entity by itself? It is not. Speech isn't an entity by itself. It isn't an object or some type of item speech. Speech is just something that occurs from someone else. It's not something that happens by itself. Your speech is from you, within you, from you. It's not a separate item to you. So speech isn't an entity in and of itself. Rather, it goes with something. And so, if we understand that speech is not an entity, rather it is a part of something, then in that case, in this instance, of course, we're talking about the speech of Allah. So that speech is an attribute of Allah. And all of the attributes of Allah are not created. The attributes of Allah are not created. And speech is certainly an attribute of Allah. Because logically everybody even knows speech isn't an entity by itself. Rather, speech is something that emanates from someone else. So the speech, it emanates from Allah. It is an attribute of Allah. And all of the attributes of Allah are not created, uncreated. Because Allah and all of His attributes, the same ruling applies. They are all from the same ruling. The attributes of Allah are not created. وأيضا لو كان مخلوقا لبطل مدلول الأمر والنهي والخبر والاستخبار لأن هذه الصيغ لو كانت مخلوقة لكانت مجرد أشكال خلقت على هذه الصورة لا دلالة لها على معناها كما يكون شكل النجوم والشمس والقمر ونحوها. This is slightly more complicated now. The Shaykh is saying if it was created, if they were created, if speech was created, then the evidence that you take from commands and prohibitions and other news and information that has come to us, if we're saying these are just entities by themselves, all of these commandments and prohibitions are entities by themselves, then they would simply be objects without meaning. A word is by itself an object without meaning. A written down word, if it was just random letters put together, it's a word with no meaning. The Shaykh said if these commands and prohibitions were creations, they were not the attribute and the speech of Allah, then they would not have meaning by themselves. That speech would not have a meaning in and of itself. So that's the third part, غَيْرُ مَخْلُوق. The speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not created, very simply because it is an attribute of Allah, and the attributes of Allah are not created. Then we also said after that, minhu bada'a, that the Quran emanated from Allah. That's easy. Because why? Why do we say minhu bada'a? يعني القرآن minhu min Allah bada'a. Why do we say that? Very simply because Allah spoke with the Quran. Where did the Quran start from? Allah spoke the Quran. So from Him it began. From Allah, when He spoke the Quran. Minhu bada'a. أي هو الذي ابتدأ به وتكلم به أولا. Allah is the one who initially spoke the Quran. So that's obvious. Minhu bada'a. That from Allah it began. And إليه يعود. The final part when it says وإليه. In fact, before we get to that, we say minhu bada'a, that from Allah it began. But there are certain ayat in the Quran, in the Sunnah, in the Quran ayat, where the Quran is attributed to the messenger, and the Quran in other ayat is attributed to Jibreel. So then what if somebody says you can't say minhu bada'a, because there are ayat attributing the Quran to the Prophet, and there are ayat attributing the Quran to Jibreel. Like for example, in the ayah, إِنَّهُ لَقَوْلُ رَسُولٍ كَرِيمٍ. إِنَّهُ لَقَوْلُ رَسُولٍ كَرِيمٍ. Who is the Rasul Kareem being mentioned in that ayah in Taqweem? Jibreel alayhi salam. In the tafsir of those ayat, when you examine and analyze, that is Jibreel alayhi salam being spoken of there. And innahu laqawlu rasulin kareem. So the qawl, this statement, this Quran, the ayat are being attributed to Jibreel in that ayah. And in another example, in Al-Haqqah, إنه لقول رسول كريم again وما هو بقول شاعر. In this tafsir of Al-Haqqa, إنه لقول رسول كريم, who's the Rasul being spoken about there? Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In the tafsir you can examine and you'll see. In Al-Haqqa it is in reference to the messenger. So the qawl is being attributed to him there. And in At-Takwir, the Rasul is in reference to Jibreel alayhi salam. So the qawl is being attributed to him there. But then, how do we explain that? When we are saying, minhu bada'a. From Allah it began. Yet here it is being attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, being attributed to Jibreel. How do we explain that? No doubt of the attribution of the Quran to Jibreel and to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But the easy explanation is that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and Jibreel alayhi salam, they are attributed with the Quran as the ones who conveyed it, not the ones who started it and said it first. They conveyed it. The qawl that is being attributed to them is the qawl in terms of conveying it. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam conveyed the Quran. It's attributed to him in that way. Jibreel alayhi salam came and conveyed it from Allah to the messenger. It's attributed to him in that way. But in terms of its attribution to Allah, then that is the initial and the origin when Allah first spoke with the Quran. So they are easy to understand, that's an easy explanation. The attribution to Allah is the source, and the attribution to Muhammad ﷺ and Jibreel ﷺ is an attribution of conveying only. Then the final part of the definition of Ahl Sunnah, we say, وَإِلَيْهِ يَعُودُ, and to Him, to Allah, it will return. To Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it will return. This can be understood in different ways. Firstly, كما جاء في بعض الآثار يسرى عليه في ليلة فيصبح الناس ليس بين أيديهم قرآن لا في صدورهم ولا في مصاحفهم يرفعه الله عز وجل. There is a narration or some narrations that indicate there will come a time where on one night the Quran will be completely removed from this earth. So the masahif, it will be taken from it, they will become blank. And the memorizers of the Quran, it will be taken from them, they will have not any memorization left. That it will literally be removed and raised. The Quran in one go, in one night, will all be taken away. Back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Taken from the masahif, taken from the memorization, taken. Gone in one night. And there are some narrations indicating that. One of those from Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiyallahu anhu, لَيَنْزَعَنَّ الْقُرْآنَ مِنْ بَيْنِ أَظْهِرِكُمْ أو لينزعن القرآن من بين أظهركم, that the Quran will be stripped from you. The Quran will be stripped from you. يسري عليه ليلا فيذهب من أجواف الرجال فلا يبقى في الأرض منه شيء. That on one night it will be removed from the chests of mankind also. Those who had memorized it, in one night it will be taken and they no longer know it. All of the Quran removed. There are some narrations of that nature. Of course, there may be some difference over the authenticity, but what appears to be the case is that some of these narrations do have validity to them. So that is one possible explanation of why Ahl Sunnah say, وَإِلَيْهِ يَعُودُ, that it will all return back to Him completely. And this, according to these narrations then, هذا والله أعلم حينما يعرض عنه الناس إعراضا كليا لا يتلونه لفظا ولا عقيدة ولا عملا فإنه يرفع. That this will occur at the end of time when the people have abandoned the Quran. They have abandoned the Quran completely and they don't recite it anymore and they don't have any aqidah regarding it, they do not act upon it. And so then Allah completely removes the Quran. لأن القرآن أشرف من أن يبقى بين يدي أناس هجروه وأعرضوا عنه فلا يقدرونه قدره. وهذا والله أعلم نظير هدم الكعبة في آخر الزمان. Because the Quran, it has nobility and honor, and it is of greater nobility and honor than for it to remain amongst a people who have completely turned away from it. When there comes a time and the people have completely turned away from it, the Quran has greater nobility than to remain amongst such people. So then Allah will remove it completely and take it completely. وهذا والله أعلم نظير هدم الكعبة في آخر الزمان. And this is similar to how at the end of time it is mentioned how the Kaaba will be destroyed. At the end of time when the people once again have shunned away to the degree that they have no respect and honor and dignity anymore for these affairs. And so at the end of time, that occurs also. حيث يأتي رجل من الحبشة, it's mentioned about the narration, how the man will come, a short man from Habasha, and the destruction of the Kaaba occurs brick by brick, stone by stone, it will be removed. وهكذا يتمادون الأحجار إلى أن يرموها في البحر, and then they will go and throw the stones from the walls of the Kaaba, the bricks, out into the ocean. And so the Shaykh says maybe this is similar to that type of situation. The second understanding of وَإِلَيْهِ يَعُودُ أنه يعود إلى الله وصفا، أي أنه لا يوصف به أحد سوى الله، فيكون المتكلم بالقرآن هو الله عز وجل وهو الموصوف به. The second understanding of why Ahlul Sunnah have explained that at the end of the definition وَإِلَيْهِ يَعُودُ, that it returns to him not literally and physically, but in terms of the attribution, in terms of the sifah, that the Quran, it is attributed to Allah. To Him it returns, because to Him it began, from Him it began, to Him it returns. The Quran is the speech of Allah, so it returns back to Him. It returns back to Allah. It is the speech of Allah. So they say maybe ilayhi ya'ud just means in terms of the speech of Allah, the attribute, it returns back to Allah. Just like it began from Allah, it returns back to Allah. That is the speech of Allah. So some of them said it's not about the literal and physical return of the Quran, but generally in terms of the attribute of speech, it returns back to Allah. And the reality is, which of those two opinions should we take? Which of the two opinions should we take? We need to know the Aqidah. Aqidah of Ahlul Sunnah. We need to know what Aqidah to be upon. Take both? Both. Anybody else?
Second one's already like it's already affirmed that it's attributed to Allah.
So
There's no need to have that emphasis for that.
So therefore take the first?
Yeah.
Sort of.
The first, because the second definition implies that the speech of Allah is a separate entity to Him and that it will return back to Him.
Not necessarily. What they mean by it, I understand what you're saying, but what they mean by it is that this is an attribute of Allah. Then by default, the understanding of an attribute is that it is always from Allah. It is to Allah always. From Him it began, to Him it returns. It's always the attribute of Allah.
If it's always the attribute of Allah, then wouldn't it be wrong to say that it would return back to Him because it's always with Him?
No, it doesn't mean physically return back. They mean by it that generally it comes from Allah, it returns to Allah. It is the attribute of Allah in all sense, not physically that it goes back to Him. But in all of the cases, both opinions are correct. There's no contradiction between them. There is no contradiction between the two opinions. It is the attribute of Allah, speech of Allah, and it will physically return back to Allah, as many scholars do say. Those narrations are authentic about the Quran being removed at the end of time. So both can be correct and there is no problem with that. فلا مانع من أن نقول إن المعنيين كلاهما صحيح. So there isn't a problem. We can say both of those statements are correct. However, there are people, the Mu'tazilah, they claim that the Quran is created. The Mu'tazilah, they claim that the Quran is created and that it is not the speech of Allah. That is the belief of the Mu'tazilah. And what is the evidence they use? Because remember, the people of innovation, they always had something that they use. some ayah that they misinterpret, some hadith they misinterpret, something else. They always have something that they will misinterpret or use incorrectly. So what is it that they use to try and say that the Quran is not the speech of Allah? One of the evidences in Az-Zumar 62, Allahu khaliqu kulli shay wa huwa ala kulli shay'in wakil. Allah is the creator of kulli shay, of everything. That's what the ayah says. Allah is the creator of everything. Is the Quran a thing? They say the Quran is a thing, and Allah is the creator of everything. They say the Quran is a thing, and so therefore it is also created, and the Quran proves it. The Quran says that Allah created everything, and they say the Quran is a thing, and therefore it is created. فالقرآن شيء فيدخل في عموم قوله كل شيء ولأنه ما ثم إلا خالق ومخلوق والله خالق وما سواه مخلوق. And they say because there are only two options, either you have the creator and you have the creation. Only two options. And they say the Quran then has to go under kulli shay and be one of the creation. It is one of the things, and everything Allah created it. So they say the Quran, it is created by using that general evidence. And this is what the scholars have highlighted. Ahlul Bid'ah, sometimes they might even use an evidence that is authentic. This ayah, of course, obviously, ayah of the Quran, legitimate, correct, authentic, no doubt, obviously. But sometimes and very often they will use an ayah in its general sense without putting it together with the other ayat and the other ahadith to get the final understanding. When you don't put things together with the rest of the revelation and you take something by itself, you could come to an incorrect conclusion. But when you put that hadith or that ayah together with all of the others, then you understand the full picture properly. Then you understand what this evidence is supposed to mean. So here they didn't do that, and this is the way of Ahlul Bid'ah. They take an ayah or a hadith by itself, and when you look at that ayah by itself, it can have a misunderstanding to it and a misinterpretation to it that they apply. But only when you put the ayah together with everything else, then it becomes clear actually it means such and such. So this is one of the ayat they used. However, it can be refuted very easily. Firstly, they said everything is either created or creation, the creator or the creation. Two options. Either something is the creation or it is the creator. And they said the Quran has to be one of the creation. We say straight away there is no logic behind that whatsoever. Why? The Quran is an attribute of Allah, and the attributes of Allah are not created. So the Quran is within the Creator. It is from the Creator, an attribute of the Creator. It does not go into your logic of it has to be from the creation. That's the first and obvious. The second, that these types of phrases in the Quran, when Allah says kulli shay, everything, is that a general statement? It is. That is a general type of phrase, everything. But these types of phrases, they can have a specific meaning to them. The phrase may sound like an open, broad phrase, but the meaning behind it can be specific. Like, for example, Queen Sheba, Saba. Is it not said about her in the Quran, وَأُوتِيَتْ مِنْ كُلِّ شَيْءٍ, that she was given everything? Was she given the whole dunya? No, but the Quran says, كُلِّ شَيْءٍ, أُوتِيَتْ مِنْ كُلِّ شَيْءٍ. She was given from everything. Everything on the world, she was given a portion of it. Is that the case? No, it is not. Of course, we know that is not how it was. قَدْ خَرَجَ شَيْءٌ كَثِيرٌ لَمْ يَدْخُلْ فِي مُلْكِهَا مِنْهُ شَيْءٍ. There were many affairs that were not in her kingdom. So we can see, even though the phrase is generalized, it doesn't necessitate that it means every single thing. In her kingdom, she did not have every single thing, but the phrase is used in that way to indicate the vast amount that she had. فإن قال قائل هل هناك فرق كبير بين قولنا إنه منزل وقولنا إنه مخلوق? So if a person was to say, is there a difference then between saying that it is revealed and saying that it is created? We say نعم بينهما فرق كبير جرت بسببه المحنة الكبرى في عصر الإمام أحمد. فإذا قلنا إنه منزل فهذا ما جاء به القرآن، وإذا قلنا إنه مخلوق لزم من ذلك تكذيب للقرآن. Then if we start to mix up this type of terminology and say it is created instead of munazzal, created clearly would be belying the Quran, because the Quran tells us that it was from his amr, and the amr was different to his khalq, different to his khalq. So it was not created, and if you begin to say it was created, then that would be belying the Quran. So there were two replies generally there when they say that Allah created everything and the Quran is a thing. We say firstly that the creator and the creation, we do not agree with you that you put the Quran into the creation. The Quran is an attribute of Allah and the attributes of Allah are not created. The ruling on the attributes is the same ruling that you have in regards to the essence of Allah. Allah and His attributes, the same thing. The attributes are not created then. And secondly, even if the ayah says kulli shay, it doesn't necessitate every single item. As we can see in other parts of the Quran, it says kulli shay, like with regards to Queen Sheba, and she did not have every single thing. So again, the Quran would not be within that as something that was created. The fourth, the second ayah. That was the first ayah. The second ayah. وَقَدْ كَانَ فَرِيقٌ مِّنْهُمْ يَسْمَعُونَ كَلَامَ اللَّهِ ثُمَّ يُحَرِّفُونَهُ مِنْ بَعْدِ مَا عَقَلُوهُ وَهُمْ يَعْلَمُونَ. And there were a group from amongst them who would hear the speech of Allah, then they would distort it, change it and alter it after they had understood it and they knew. This is in the ayat of Surah Al-Baqarah, highlights that a group of them from the who? A group of who? Jews, yeah. A group of the Jews. A group of the Jews, and not just any of the Jews, but the ulama of the Jews, in reference to the educated ones from amongst them. A group of the ulama of the Jews. they would يسمعون كلام الله. They would hear the speech of Allah, and this could intend يحتمل أن يراد به القرآن, that it could mean the Quran. وهو ظاهر صنيع المؤلف فيكون دليلا على أن القرآن كلام الله. It could mean that a group of the Jews, they now hear the Quran, the actual Quran, and they understand it, but then they distort it and reject it. And it could mean يحتمل أن يراد به كلام الله تعالى لموسى حين اختار موسى 70 رجلا لميقات الله تعالى فكلمه الله وهم يسمعون. And it could mean in reference to when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala spoke to Musa alayhi salam, that they heard the speech of Allah when Allah spoke to Musa alayhi salam. وَأَيًّا كَانَ, but whichever one it is, whether it is in reference to them listening and hearing the Quran, or listening when Allah spoke to Musa alayhi salam, in both cases they have listened and heard the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In both cases that speech was audible to them, it was heard by them. فالكلام صفة المتكلم وليس شيئا بائنا منه. So the speech is an attribute that is connected to the speaker, and it is not something separate. And Allah tells us about them that they did that, this rejection, after they had understood it. من بعد ما عقلوه هذا أشد في قبح عملهم وجرأتهم على الله. This is the most severe, even more severe in the ugliness, in the degrading act that they did, and their boldness upon Allah, that they changed it after they had understood what was going on. After they had understood what was going on and they had comprehended it, they then began distorting it still and changing it still. لأن الذي يحرف المعنى عن جهل أهون من الذي يحرفه بعد العقل والعلم. Because if somebody was to distort something because they've not really understood it in the first place, that's not as bad. It is lighter. But somebody who has understood, and after having understood and comprehended, still going upon deviation and distortion, then that is worse. That brings us to the end of the second ayah. We'll leave it on that one for today. We'll start on ayah number 3 next time, insha'Allah ta'ala, continuing with the evidences regarding the speech of Allah.